My mom has always had this quiet confidence when it comes to my life. Not confidence in me exactly. Confidence that she gets to decide. She never raises her voice or makes a scene. She just states things like they're facts already agreed upon, and you're weird if you question them. Growing up, that tone shaped everything. What I studied, where I lived, what counted as real work, what didn't. So when she said, "You don't have a stable job right now, so you can watch your brother's kids," it landed exactly the way all her decisions did. Calm, certain, final. It wasn't a question. There was no pause for my input. No space where I could say yes or no. It was delivered like a weather update, like something that was already happening whether I acknowledged it or not. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "It'll just be for a few days." That sentence carried history. Every time she said just a few days, it meant weeks. It meant rearranging my life. It meant canceling plans. It meant being expected to sacrifice quietly and then be grateful for the opportunity to help. My older brother had 3 kids. I loved them truly. They were sweet in their own chaotic way. But 3 kids under 10 is not a small favor. It's full-time work. It's noise and schedules and mess and exhaustion. And somehow, that responsibility always fell on me, never him. Because he had a real job. I didn't, according to her. I freelanced. I worked remotely. I managed multiple clients. I paid my bills without asking anyone for help. But because I didn't leave the house in business clothes every morning, because my work didn't fit her idea of stability, she treated my time like it was empty, like it was hers to fill. That part always stung more than I admitted. Not because I doubted myself, but because it reminded me how little my choices mattered to her unless they looked familiar. What she didn't know was that for once, I'd chosen something just for me. A cruise. Not a last-minute thing. Not an impulse. I'd planned it months ago. Saved for it. Booked it quietly. I needed the break more than I'd realized at the time. Deadlines, stress, constantly being the backup plan for everyone else. I was burned out in a way sleep didn't fix. The confirmation emails were sitting in my inbox. My suitcase was half-packed in the living room. I was supposed to leave the next morning. When she made her declaration, I didn't correct her. Didn't push back. Didn't explain my plans. Part of me knew explaining would turn into arguing, and arguing would turn into guilt. She'd sigh. She'd say things like, "Family comes first," or "I guess I'll figure something out since you don't care." I didn't have the energy for that conversation. So I said, "We'll talk." 2 words. Neutral. Non-committal. She nodded like that meant agreement. That night, I barely slept. Not because I felt guilty, but because something in me had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to accommodate her expectations. I was sitting with my own plans, protecting them quietly. The next morning, I heard the knock. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was the kind of knock that assumes compliance. The kind that says, "I'm here to drop something off, not ask permission." When I opened the door, there they were. My mom, standing confidently on the porch. My brother's 3 kids clustered around her, backpacks slung over their shoulders. One was already whining about being hungry. Another was bouncing on the step. A third clutched a tablet with the volume too loud. There was also a garbage bag full of clothes sitting by her feet. She smiled like she'd just solved a scheduling puzzle. "Perfect timing," she said brightly. "I'll be back in a few days." And before I could process what was happening, she turned around and walked down the path to her car. No hug. No instructions. No conversation about consent or availability. Just assumption. I stood there in the doorway, the sound of her car pulling away filling the silence. The kids rushed inside like they owned the place. Shoes kicked off. Voices echoing. Questions flying at me all at once. I looked around my living room. At the suitcase by the couch. At my passport sitting on the table. At the quiet life I'd planned to step into in less than 12 hours. She hadn't noticed any of it. She hadn't asked where I was going. She hadn't considered that I might have plans. Because in her mind, my time was flexible. disposable, secondary. And standing there, watching my carefully planned break collide with her entitlement, something became very clear. She thought she'd just secured free childcare. What she didn't know was that I was already emotionally checked out. And physically, I was about to be too. Because while she was driving away, confident she'd handled everything, I was looking at my suitcase and realizing something important. This time, I wasn't canceling my life to fix hers. I was going to the port, and she was about to find out what happens when you assume someone will always stay behind. I stayed exactly where I was for a few seconds after my mom's car disappeared. The driveway was suddenly quiet, like the world had paused just long enough for me to finally see the pattern I'd been living inside for years. 3 small faces looked up at me, confused but trusting, backpacks at their feet, expecting that of course I would handle it. Of course I would step in. I always did. And that realization landed heavier than any argument ever had. This wasn't a one-time misunderstanding. This wasn't stress or poor planning. This was routine. My time was assumed. My plans were optional. My life was treated like overflow storage for everyone else's responsibilities. If someone else messed up, I absorbed it. If someone else needed help, I rearranged myself. And the wildest part was that no one ever thought to ask if I was okay with it. I looked at the kids again and felt that familiar tug of guilt. I loved them. That had always been the leverage. Love mixed with obligation until the two were impossible to separate. And my mom knew that. She always had. She counted on the fact that I wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't say no, wouldn't let the kids feel abandoned even if I was the one being pushed aside. But this time, something was different. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Clean, sharp clarity. I pulled my phone out and called my brother. Straight to voicemail. No surprise there. He worked long hours and liked to say he was unreachable, but somehow he was always reachable when he needed something. Just not when I did. I didn't leave a long message. I didn't explain. I didn't soften it. I texted him one sentence. Simple. Direct. Your kids are at my place. I'm leaving for a trip. You need to come get them. I stared at the message after sending it, half expecting my chest to tighten or my hands to shake with regret. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Like I'd finally put something heavy down after carrying it for too long. Still, I wasn't reckless. This wasn't about punishing anyone, and it definitely wasn't about putting the kids in a bad situation. I called my neighbor, someone who had watched them before, someone I trusted. I explained calmly that my mom had dropped the kids off without notice and that I had to leave for a pre-planned trip. I asked if she could stay with them until my brother arrived. She didn't hesitate. She agreed immediately, probably because she'd seen this pattern too. I gathered the kids, brought them inside, gave them snacks, turned on a movie, and explained that their dad would be coming soon. I kept my voice steady. I smiled. I didn't let them see the weight of the moment because this wasn't their fault. It never was. Then I did something I'd never done before. I chose myself anyway. I grabbed my suitcase, which had been sitting by the couch since the night before. I hadn't even moved it out of sight because some part of me had already known. I wrote down instructions, emergency numbers, where everything was. I double-checked that my neighbor had my number, even though I already knew I wouldn't be answering for a while. When I locked my door behind me, my hands did shake, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. The kind you feel right before you do something that breaks a long-standing rule you never agreed to but were expected to follow. The drive to the airport felt surreal, like I was watching my life from the outside. Half of me kept waiting for a phone call that would make me turn around. Half of me dared anyone to try. At the airport, surrounded by strangers dragging suitcases, complaining about lines, sipping overpriced coffee, I felt oddly invisible in the best possible way. No one needed anything from me. No one expected me to fix anything. I was just another person moving through the world with a destination of her own. I boarded the ship that afternoon under a bright sky, the kind that feels symbolic even if you try not to be dramatic about it. When the ship pulled away from the dock and the water stretched out in front of me, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for years. That's when I turned my phone back on, just briefly. The screen lit up instantly. Missed calls from my mom. Back to back. Texts stacked so fast they blurred together. My brother's name popped up too, finally. Messages marked urgent. A couple from extended family members who clearly had been looped in and were now panicking on behalf of people who had never panicked for me. I didn't open anything. I switched the phone to airplane mode and slid it into my bag because I already knew what they were saying. They were angry. They were shocked. They were demanding explanations. They were framing this as abandonment, as irresponsibility, as me being selfish. They were rewriting the story in real time so that my boundaries looked like betrayal instead of what they really were. But for the first time, I wasn't going to correct the narrative. I walked up to the deck, drink in hand, ocean breeze hitting my face, and felt something settle into place. This wasn't running away. This wasn't revenge. This was choosing not to be available for a role I never auditioned for. Somewhere back home, my mom was probably yelling. My brother was scrambling. People were realizing that the safety net they relied on had quietly stepped aside. And for once, that wasn't my problem. I leaned against the railing, watching the water churn behind the ship, and let myself enjoy the simple, radical act of not fixing anything. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what everyone assumes you won't. Leave. I didn't listen to the voicemail right away. I let it sit there unread, unheard, like a sealed envelope I already knew the contents of. I didn't need to hear my mom's voice to understand the message. I'd lived versions of it my entire life. The anger, the blame, the way responsibility always slid downhill until it landed at my feet. That night on the cruise ship, everything felt surreal. The deck lights were low, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and people around me were laughing, clinking glasses, talking about excursions and sunsets. Normal vacation stuff. Peaceful stuff. The kind of calm that makes you realize just how loud your everyday life usually is. I stood at the railing for a long time, letting the wind hit my face, thinking about how small the world feels when you finally step out of the role everyone assigned you. Back home, chaos had replaced the neat little plan my mom thought she'd executed perfectly. She hadn't asked my brother. She hadn't coordinated schedules. She hadn't prepared the kids emotionally. She had just assumed that, like always, I would bend. That I would cancel. That I would rearrange my life to absorb the inconvenience so nobody else had to. When my brother arrived and realized I wasn't there, the reality hit hard. 3 kids. Packed bags. No instructions beyond what I'd left with the neighbor. And no backup plan. That's when the yelling started. Not at him. At me. Because in her mind, I was the variable that malfunctioned. The system only broke because I stepped out of line. My phone stayed silent on my end, but I could almost picture it. My mom pacing, raising her voice, telling everyone how irresponsible I was, how selfish, how I'd run off instead of doing what family does. The funny thing is, none of that was new. What was new was that I wasn't there to absorb it. When I finally listened to the voicemail later that evening, I did it sitting on my balcony, the sound of waves underneath her shouting. The contrast was almost absurd. Her voice was sharp, frantic, accusatory. She wasn't worried about me. She wasn't asking if I was safe. She wasn't asking where I was. She wanted control back. She wanted me to come home and put everything back where it belonged so she wouldn't have to explain herself to my brother. "You embarrass me," she said, like that was the real crime. That sentence stuck with me. Not "the kids were scared." Not "we should have talked first." Not even "I'm sorry." Just embarrassment. That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not hurt. Something quieter and heavier. Understanding. This wasn't about childcare. It never was. It was about authority. About roles that were never questioned. About a family structure where my availability was assumed because my independence was never fully respected. My brother's call came after that. Different tone entirely. Careful. Measured. He sounded tired. Overwhelmed. Not angry, just scrambling. He didn't accuse me. He didn't yell. He asked. That alone told me everything. He asked if I could come back early. He said Mom had messed up. He said things had gotten more complicated than expected. He said the kids were fine, but the situation was tense. I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't upset that I had plans. He was upset that he'd been dragged into something without consent, the same way I always was. For the first time, he was standing where I usually stood. I told him the truth. Calmly. No speeches. No drama. I said I hadn't been asked. I'd been informed. I said I'd already paid for my trip. I said I wasn't canceling. There was a pause on the line. A long one. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he finally understood something he'd never had to think about before. What it feels like when someone decides your time belongs to them. After that, the calls slowed down. Not because the problem was solved, but because the usual solution was no longer available. My mom didn't apologize. She didn't soften her stance. She just went quiet. That silence felt different from before. It wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. She was trying to figure out what version of me she was dealing with now. And as I sat there listening to the ocean, I realized something that felt both sad and freeing. I wasn't the one who changed. I just stopped compensating for everyone else. The cruise continued. Days passed. I slept better than I had in years. Ate when I was hungry. Did nothing when I felt like doing nothing. The world didn't collapse. The kids were taken care of. My brother figured it out. My mom survived the embarrassment. Everything kept moving, just without me in the middle of it. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't a one-time boundary. It was the beginning of a different life. When I stepped back into my apartment after the cruise, the silence felt different. Not empty. Not lonely. It felt earned. The kind of quiet that comes after you finally do something for yourself and realize the world didn't end because of it. My suitcase rolled across the floor. Sunburn fading. Mind clear. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't replaying conversations in my head or bracing for the next demand. I wasn't anticipating guilt. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. That alone told me something had shifted. The first person to reach out after I got back was my mom. Not immediately. There was a delay this time. A pause where she seemed to be deciding which version of herself to show. The angry one didn't come back. Neither did the commanding one. Instead, she went with casual. She called and said, well, I guess everything worked out in the end. Like the whole situation had just been a scheduling hiccup. Like she hadn't dumped 3 kids at my door without consent. Like she hadn't screamed into my voicemail demanding I fix something she caused. I listened without interrupting. That was new too. Usually, I'd jump in. Smooth things over. Make it easier for everyone. This time, I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the point land. Then I said it. Calm. Clear. No edge. Helping is voluntary. Dumping isn't. The line hung there. She didn't argue. Didn't deflect. Didn't joke it away. She just went quiet. And in that quiet, I realized she heard me. Maybe not fully accepted it yet, but she heard it. That moment mattered more than any apology. My brother was different too. He didn't come in loud or defensive. When he reached out, it was careful. Measured. Like someone stepping onto ice they weren't sure would hold. He said he should have checked with me first. That Mom had assumed. That he hadn't known about my plans. He didn't say sorry the way movies make apologies sound. But he asked before speaking next time. And that was enough. What surprised me most was how little I needed them to change for me to feel different. I used to think boundaries only worked if the other person respected them immediately. If they acknowledged them. If they validated them. Turns out, boundaries work the moment you enforce them. The kids were fine. That part mattered to me more than anything. They'd stayed with people they knew. They were safe. Federal entertained. By the time I saw them again, they barely remembered the shuffle. To them, it was just a weird weekend story. But the adults remembered. They remembered because something cracked open that couldn't be sealed back up. The illusion that my time was endlessly flexible, that my life existed on standby, that I would always adjust so others wouldn't have to. That illusion died the moment I locked my door and went to the port. After that, little things changed. My mom asked instead of told. Sometimes she'd still slip, start a sentence the old way, then correct herself mid-thought. It was awkward, but it was progress. My brother didn't drop his kids off unannounced anymore. He checked dates, confirmed times, respected no as an answer instead of treating it like a delay. And me? I stopped explaining. That was the biggest shift of all. I didn't justify my schedule. I didn't over-communicate my plans. I didn't feel the need to prove that my work was real or my rest was earned. I didn't frame my boundaries in soft language to make them easier to swallow. I just lived my life. And the wild part is nothing bad happened because of it. No family collapse. No permanent fallout. No dramatic estrangement. Just a recalibration. A reset of roles that should have happened years ago. I realized something important in those weeks after I got back. People don't always disrespect you because they're cruel. Sometimes they do it because you've trained them to. Not intentionally. Not consciously. But through years of stepping in, stepping up, and stepping aside. When you stop doing that, it feels shocking to them. Not because you're wrong, but because the system they benefited from just changed. And systems hate change. But growth requires it. That cruise wasn't about running away. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about proving to myself that I was allowed to choose my own life without asking permission. Once you do that, you don't unlearn it. You don't go back to being the default. You don't go back to absorbing responsibility that isn't yours. You don't go back to shrinking your plans so others can feel comfortable. You become someone who asks one simple question before saying yes. Do I actually want to do this? If the answer is no, you don't negotiate with your guilt. You don't debate your worth. You just decline. That realization stayed with me long after the tan faded and the photos got buried in my phone. Because the truth is, I didn't abandon anyone. I just stopped abandoning myself. And once people realize you're no longer the safety net they can casually fall into, they treat you differently. With more care, more respect, more awareness. Not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated it. That weekend changed the dynamic forever. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. And honestly, I wouldn't trade that lesson for anything. Here's the part that takes people the longest to understand, and honestly, it took me years too. Choosing yourself doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't come with a dramatic speech or a clean moment where everyone suddenly gets it. Most of the time, it shows up quietly, almost awkwardly, like you're doing something wrong even when you aren't. It feels unfamiliar because you've spent so long being the reliable one, the flexible one, the person who absorbs inconvenience so others don't have to. For most of my life, I thought being needed was the same thing as being valued. If someone depended on me, if they leaned on me, if they handed me their problems and walked away lighter, I assumed that meant I mattered. It never occurred to me that I was slowly teaching people a dangerous lesson. That my time was optional. That my plans were adjustable. That my needs could wait indefinitely. The cruise didn't magically fix my family. It didn't turn my mother into a different person or my brother into someone suddenly self-aware. What it did was far more important. It changed the way I showed up. And when you change your position in a system, the system has no choice but to adjust. When I came back, I noticed the shift immediately. Conversations felt different. Requests were phrased differently. There was hesitation where there used to be assumption. That hesitation was new. Uncomfortable for them, but grounding for me. It was the sound of people realizing that access to you isn't automatic. My mom tried to smooth it over the way she always does, with humor and minimization. She framed it as a misunderstanding, a simple mix-up, something that got blown out of proportion. In the past, I would have accepted that explanation just to restore peace. I would have nodded, swallowed the frustration, and reassured her that everything was fine. This time, I didn't. I didn't argue either. I didn't list past examples or bring up old resentment. I just stated a boundary clearly and without emotion. Helping is a choice. Being volunteered is not. That distinction landed harder than any argument ever could. It forced her to confront something she'd avoided for years. That I wasn't upset because I helped. I was upset because I wasn't asked. That difference matters. My brother changed too, slowly, almost awkwardly. He started checking in instead of assuming. Sometimes he stumbled over his words, like he wasn't sure what the new rules were. And honestly, neither was I at first. When you stop being the default solution, there's an adjustment period on both sides. You have to resist the urge to jump in and fix things just because you can. That urge doesn't disappear overnight. It's a habit built over years. The kids were fine. That part is important. They weren't harmed. They weren't scared. They weren't abandoned. They were loved and cared for, just not by the person everyone expected to do the caring without question. The crisis existed entirely in the adults' minds, and that realization stuck with me. So many emergencies aren't real emergencies. They're convenience problems. They feel urgent only because someone is used to you solving them. The biggest change, though, happened internally. I stopped narrating my decisions to justify them. I stopped over-explaining why I couldn't help, why I wasn't available, why I needed space. I realized something uncomfortable but freeing. People who respect you don't require explanations. And people who demand them usually aren't interested in understanding anyway. That cruise wasn't about escaping responsibility. It was about reclaiming ownership of my life. It was about proving, quietly and firmly, that my existence isn't a holding pattern for other people's needs. That my time is not a community resource unless I decide to share it. There's a strange guilt that comes with this realization. You worry that you're being selfish, that you're letting people down, that you're changing in a way others won't like. And that part is true. Some people won't like it because your boundaries force them to confront their own behavior. And not everyone is ready for that. But here's what I learned. Self-respect doesn't require permission. It doesn't need validation. And it doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from consistency, from choosing yourself again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disrupts familiar patterns. My mom doesn't dump responsibilities on me anymore, not because she suddenly understands everything, but because she understands one thing clearly. I won't absorb them by default. My brother doesn't assume my time is his, not because he became more considerate overnight, but because he learned that assumptions have consequences. And I don't explain my boundaries anymore. I don't package them gently or apologize for them. I state them and let people react however they need to. That reaction is their responsibility, not mine. The truth is, the moment you stop fixing what you didn't break, people are forced to deal with their own mess. Some will resent you for it. Some will respect you for it. And some will quietly adjust without ever acknowledging the shift. That's fine. Because the goal was never to teach them a lesson. The goal was to stop teaching myself that my life comes second. And once you learn that lesson, really learn it, everything changes. If this story hit close to home, don't just scroll away. Hit like if you believe boundaries matter. Subscribe for more real stories where people finally choose themselves. And comment if you've ever been treated like the default and decided to stop. Because the best stories aren't about revenge. They're about self-respect.